All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the raw data, the speeches, and the complex closed-door realities of the highly anticipated NATO summit that just wrapped up in Ankara, Turkey. We're going to take this massive mountain of summit data and distill it down into some clear, key takeaways so you can understand exactly where this historic alliance stands today. Okay, let's dive right in. To make sense of this sprawling event, we've broken the summit down into 5 main themes: the Ankara summit stakes, the aggressive 5% defense spending push, the billion-dollar tech deals, how they're handling current global hotspots, and finally, the internal unity and tensions shaping NATO 3.0. So, starting with part 1, the Ankara summit stakes, defining NATO 3.0 in a changing world. You really can't grasp the gravity of the decisions made at this summit without first looking at the threats these leaders are dealing with. As Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau pointed out, the alliance is facing this rapid, terrifying shift toward hybrid and autonomous warfare. Add the rise of hypersonic missiles into the mix, and it's intense. Plus, Russia is now being treated as a direct, acute adversary, and new vulnerabilities are expanding really quickly up in the high north. Honestly, it's a completely different battlefield than it was even a decade ago. And sitting in that room, trying to navigate this immense pressure cooker, were the leaders of 32 allied nations. That number is crucial, right? Because it represents a collective defense umbrella covering 1 billion people. We're talking about the security of your home, your data, your economy. Literally every decision, every point of friction, and every single dollar spent has to be carefully coordinated across 32 different capitals. Moving right along to Section 2, the 5% defense spending push and rebalancing the financial burden. For years, the magic benchmark for NATO members was to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Well, coming out of Ankara, the alliance is making a massive, historic push to bump that target up to 5% of GDP by 2035. I mean, think about that jump. That represents an absolute avalanche of capital suddenly entering the defense sector. So the big question is this just empty political talk, or is it actually happening? Actually, if you dig into the numbers, specific nations, especially those right up against the eastern flank, are already surging toward or even exceeding these goals. Estonia, for instance, is pouring nearly 7% of its GDP into defense this year. Latvia just hit that new 5% mark, and Norway is sitting pretty at a very robust 4.7%. So this financial shift is absolutely real. President Donald Trump, who, as we know, has been a major driving force behind getting European allies to foot more of the bill, really hammered home this historic shift. At the summit, he stated, the benchmark is going to be that 5% number. Defense spending of other NATO members surged by more than almost $150 billion in 2025. Clearly, he views this as a very necessary and highly successful rebalancing of the whole transatlantic relationship. And interestingly, that perspective on the sheer financial scale was totally echoed across the aisle. Secretary General Mark Rutte highlighted the massive volume of this commitment, pointing out that $250 billion spent more in 2 years by Canada and Europe is massive. So across the board, the alliance is in broad agreement. The financial landscape of NATO has fundamentally transformed. Let's look at Section 3, billion-dollar tech and hardware, moving from setting targets to delivering results. Because the obvious follow-up question here is, what exactly are they buying with all this historic funding? Well, the summit made one thing crystal clear. They are pivoting hard from just setting financial targets to actually delivering state-of-the-art military hardware. Just to give you a sense of the sheer speed here, a mind-boggling $50 billion in new procurement deals were announced in just a single day. This isn't some theoretical, down-the-road spending plan. These are immediate, locked-in contracts with major defense contractors on both sides of the Atlantic. And the breakdown brilliantly illustrates exactly where those billions are going. First up, we have the Drone Edge Initiative, which is going to pump $40 billion into uncrewed systems over the next 5 years. Then there's a massive joint buy of 10 Saab Global Eye aircraft. These will replace the older AWACS fleet, those giant radar planes they use for early warning detection. And on a purely practical, logistical level, the alliance is dropping 27 billion euros simply to modernize the fuel infrastructure and pipelines leading out to the eastern flank. Now, to actually manage all of this, they launched something dubbed the NATO engine. See, one of the biggest bottlenecks the alliance has always faced is slow defense production. The NATO engine is built to fix that by linking up international factories and advanced manufacturing facilities. Basically, they're sharing spare capacity across borders so they can flat out outproduce their competitors. It's a real game changer. But that brings us to a really critical pivot point. We've talked about the money, we've talked about the shiny new hardware, but how is NATO actually taking this unprecedented military buildup and applying it to the geopolitical flashpoints exploding around the world right now? Which leads us right into Section 4, navigating global hotspots, putting commitments to the test. Starting with Eastern Europe, the alliance maintained a completely unified, very firm stance on the conflict with Russia. Leaders formally pledged 70 billion euros for military equipment, assistance, and training for Ukraine covering this year and next. That sends a very clear signal that the financial pipeline to Kyiv remains wide open. Shifting focus over to the Middle East, the NATO political consensus on Iran is essentially twofold. They are actively seeking to de-escalate hostilities, while at the exact same time strictly preventing Iran from acquiring any nuclear weapons or ICBM capabilities. As you can imagine, the summit featured some incredibly complex discussions trying to balance this broad alliance goal against the backdrop of recent, very forceful bilateral U.S. military strikes in the region. When you zoom out and map it all out, NATO's resources are being stretched across a truly sweeping global footprint. Right now, you've got Ukrainian forces using NATO aid to strike deep into Russian energy infrastructure. Way up north, the newly launched Arctic Sentry operation is actively pushing back against Russian and Chinese expansion in the high north. Down in the Baltic Sea, vigilance operations are sweeping for subsea cable threats and airspace incursions. And on top of all that, there's a heavy naval presence working 24/7 to secure the Strait of Hormuz. They are literally everywhere. Finally, Section 5, Unity, Tensions, and NATO 3.0, the politics of the alliance. Now, what's really fascinating here is the dynamic behind closed doors. Whenever you cram 32 world leaders into one room to manage global crises, public unity is bound to crash into private friction. I mean, anyone who's ever tried to coordinate dinner plans with 10 friends knows that getting 32 heads of state to agree on anything is a minor miracle. So we saw this incredible contrast emerge. On one hand, an undeniable triumph of collaboration on mutual defense and historic procurement deals, but on the other, intense internal frictions, like the ongoing debates over Greenland sovereignty and some sharply differing views between European nations and the U.S. regarding bilateral military operations in the Middle East. To give you a perfect example of that friction, look at the ongoing debate over the Arctic. The U.S. has openly expressed strategic interest in Greenland, but Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen drew a very firm boundary at the summit, plainly stating, "Greenland is of course not for sale. We are a sovereign state and we need everybody to respect our territorial integrity." It's a stark reminder that even within this tight-knit alliance, sovereign boundaries require incredibly careful navigation. Yet, even with those very real friction points, the overriding sentiment coming out of Ankara was one of unprecedented cooperation. President Trump summed up the atmosphere from his viewpoint, saying, "I've never seen anything like it. Every one of those countries, they love us, they love each other." That was tremendous unification. So despite the intense debates behind closed doors, these leaders walked out projecting a much stronger collective front than we've seen in years. Which leaves us with one final massive question to chew on. Can historic spending and next-generation technology permanently secure a 32-nation alliance in an era of rapidly evolving, unprecedented global threats? The money and the hardware are absolutely pouring in, but as the world gets more and more complicated, NATO 3.0 is going to be tested like never before. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will catch you on the next one.